and names, as well as a number of new folks. I ever appreciate the opportunity to engage with folks I have not had the pleasure of meeting yet. And I just want to say that it's been a while since I've addressed a group of folks under the imprimatur title of permaculture, or an event sponsored under the auspices of permaculture, though it's not the first time. In fact, I moved to Eugene, Oregon some almost 19 years ago, and within a week I was at a half-day permaculture event. And then within 3 months, I had helped plan a permaculture event at which I met my wife. And then it just kind of went from there. And I've presented at numerous permaculture events and convergences, including on the topic I'm going to speak on today, although not necessarily in the way I'll talk about it. But it's been several years and a while since I've had the opportunity to engage. And so I appreciate you all inviting me and coming out today. So what I want to speak about is, I think the title is Integrated Permaculture Economy, and we might want to put that in plural, or perhaps just put a big question mark with the title, because rather than say, here's what an integrated permaculture economy is, I'm going to pose the question as a bit of a challenge or provocation for us to be thinking about what it could be and what it might entail. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a couple of things from permaculture's foils to make my provocation, to open up the space that I think will allow us to think about a permaculture economy. And then I want to give a very concrete example of what we might think of as a permaculture economy, although they don't necessarily use that term, although they use permaculture. And then I'm going to present a model of what might be possible in the region where I live, the Pacific Northwest, that uses a little bit of some specific examples, but also presents a picture of what could be, but is not. And so I'm thinking by having concrete example, as well as what could be, that will help lay the ground for a good discussion and some questions. So that's how I'm going to begin. And if it's okay with you all, I am going to share my screen. I do have visuals and slides. I'm a visually oriented person, and I shouldn't have to apologize for that at a permaculture gathering, because permaculturists use lots of visuals. So with that, I think I will go ahead and share my screen. And so what I want to do is get to the right tab here so that I can start my slides. And I just want to pose 3 core questions that fuel my thinking on this topic. And these are pretty basic questions. The first question is, what do we need? And specifically, what do we need for fulfillment? That means to survive and thrive. Second question, how do we get what we need? And how can we do that with dignity and not having to beg, steal, or exhaust ourselves through exploitive work? Third question, how do we meet our needs indefinitely? And how do we do that with integrity and not undermining the sources of life? In other words, and by indefinitely, I mean, how do we do it over time? And any astute permaculturalist is going to recognize these 3 questions are grounded in permaculture's 3 ethics. So what do we need is talking about people care. How do we get what we need is talking about economic fair share. And how do we meet our needs indefinitely is talking about earth care. So these 3 questions that I think about when thinking about economics are very much in alignment with permaculture's ethics. And I wanted to make that connection because I think it's an important one to ground us. Certainly, when permaculture thinks about ethics, those ethics are at the center of a design science. I'm not going to go over those principles because, they're readily available. This is an image that you'll often find, utilizing the principles that David Holmgren articulated in his text, Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. And what's useful about these is in a very concise way, they articulate a kind of design science that folks can use. And what I'm going to do later is also articulate some design principles around the notion of what I'll in tongue-in-cheek call a perma economy. How do we enact those? Well, most permaculturalists are aware that when it comes to enact the design principles of permaculture, they think in terms of zones and sectors. So you'll find a common image such as this one that I pulled off the internet, zone 0 through zone 5 and so on. Very typical. And what's noticeable about this image is that it very much conforms to the original articulation of permaculture, that it's focused on agriculture using a rural setting, with typically a single dwelling at the center of that at zone 0. Here, that's not necessarily in the center, but zone 0 nevertheless is the starting point for the design. And you'll see other ways this gets represented. So a famous image from Toby Hemingway's book, here on the right of the screen, also shows the zones and some ways in which permaculturalists might draw a design plan, a pretty nice design plan. The one I have for my own property is just a bunch of circles and things. It's not colored in with shrubs and trees and so forth. But in any event, these are pretty typical. And I put these up because my first foil is going to be the notion of zones and what David Holmgren calls cellular design. So the way this, again, you'll see it represented here, a kind of bullseye picture, nested systems. I like the other images because they show contours and so on, which of course is how real landscapes are defined, that we find in the world. But Holmgren does something in his book that shifts permaculture's thinking a little bit. And he introduces this image, which I'm sure many of you have seen, where the zones are suddenly not so much the rural landscape around the immediacy of zone 0, but that the permaculture design is nested within a larger kind of social, economic, cultural, even ecological system. Holmgren tries to represent this in two ways. First, through having zones with other types of names. So you have zone 2, business and community, zone 4, national, continental, and so on. This is well beyond the kind of zones on the right, the colored ones that are typically found in permaculture design. The second thing Holmgren does is he tries to show with these 3 big black arrows on the sides pointing in, that there are different forces and flows that come from without, that flow in and through the different aspects of our lives. So the point he's making is that even the traditional permanent agriculture design of that rural farm is cut across, not just with natural flows, but also economic flows and cultural forces and so on. And, that opens up a whole realm of thinking in permaculture that many have seized, thinking about social permaculture, for example. So when you think about that farm, it's not just the landscape, but it's the relationships. And someone needs to mute, please. I'm unable to do that while presenting. Thank you. So that opens up a realm of what's called social permaculture, and people have begun to really develop that. It's also opened up thinking in permaculture around some of the politics that are involved in the larger world and the ways in which those impact what is possible, permissible in permaculture. Thinking about land use codes, for example. Can we do it or not? Is it allowable or not? Those are political questions. And Timothy Leahy's produced a book called The Politics of Permaculture, published by Pluto Press, which is a famous radical publishing house, where he goes into great detail about some of the issues and politics that have begun to inform permaculture. I note that because I think it's important that we be recognizing that permaculture is no longer just that original sensibility. And I'm saying this to people that I know understand that, but that context and evolution of its development is important, because to think about economics and permaculture and its relationship to economics requires us to get outside of the normal thinking of zones and sectors as traditionally presented in permaculture. So I want to because of something I did. Okay. So what I want to do though is I want to shift our view. I'm not going to say that the zones here you see are wrong. I just want to do what's called a perspectival shift. I want to think of them in a different way. So imagine this flat nested systems put into 3 dimensions, and it might look like something like this, like a cone. And imagine that those zones on the right actually exist towards the top of that cone. The area that I want to talk about and that I think Holmgren's pointing to is everything below that. The point being that that farm, that rural setting, that traditional permaculture design emerges out of these other contexts. In other words, we don't take the classical view of we start with where we are and expand out. The perspectival shift is to recognize that the site, that privileged locus of design and permaculture, the site emerges from forces and flows larger than itself, not just social, cultural, economic, or political flows, but also natural ones. Holmgren gives emphasis in his text, talking about, for example, 2 things that are problematic in permaculture. One, he notes that the typical design site usually is a nuclear family. Think of yards, or think of a traditional kind of rural agriculture of the nuclear family. And he's very explicit that we've learned that's just too small of a design unit to actually produce for self-reliance. He notes the need, therefore, for things like co-housing or eco-villages, and I would argue there's other forms of sociality that we could consider. The second thing he notes very explicitly in relationship to this question is that in permaculture, the landscape patterns are much larger than the site that we traditionally privilege. So for instance, he says it is difficult to fully consider the nature and implication of use and development of the wider landscape, including multinodal development, where the links between sites are as important as, or more important than, the details of each site. Whole farm planning and eco-village development, for example, require a landscape-based approach that builds on underlying patterns of the land rather than the details of particular sites. Now, this very important insight points to the dimension of thinking that I want to explore today. It's that wider landscape and wider social scape, and this notion of multinodal points of development that I think is really important. This area here that I'm circling, this is what we want to talk about. Another way to view this is to use the cellular design metaphor that Holmgren and many use in permaculture. Here's a typical visual you can find online that shows the different levels of complexity and organization of a human body. Permaculture, traditionally defined, tends to operate over at this level, in the arena of the cell, cellular design. So you can think about the tools on a farm might be some of the like molecules that get put into different systems. So like the mandala would be, I don't know, maybe a macromolecule or an organella or something like this. When all those get put together, it creates this complex cell. That's the site design. However, the question we have to ask is, what about the rest of this? What happens when different cells or sites get put together? What happens when in their complex interworkings, they have emergent properties like organs and organ systems and entire organisms? So the question then that I want to pose is, here's our lovely farm. I'm using this image purposefully because it's going to come back, but it actually shows permaculture development. There's wild spaces and there's integrated farming. And then I love there's that big combine implement there. Maybe the proud farmer hasn't sold that off yet because when they converted to permaculture, or they're wanting to scale up, so they need that technology. The point is, what's the relationship between that permaculture developed site and the larger forms of organization. That's where we want to talk about perma-economies. Now, before I get into theory or ideas on that, I want to give a concrete example to help us solidify and understand what I have in mind. To do this example, I'm going to take us to India, because for 20 years, I've been tracking a particular project there that I think is one of the best exemplifications of local integrated whole system design and development. In particular, we're going to be looking at the Anantapur district of Andhra Pradesh. So if I go back, that area in red is Andhra Pradesh, and the Anantapur district is where this particular project's located. It's called the Timbuktu Collective, and the vision of it is fairly straightforward. It is about how to empower rural communities to govern themselves, to live in social and gender harmony while maintaining a sustainable lifestyle. And the emphasis on social and gender harmony is speaking specifically to the caste system in India, as well as the gendered nature of traditional relationships in India. And so it's how to kind of overcome some of those. So here's how the collective organizes itself. What you're going to notice in this organization is that there is, of course, the all-important aspect of having, for instance, animal husbandry and organic farming and so forth, and ecological restoration and biodiversity, many things that we find in permaculture, but there's these other aspects too that hold it together. Things that I think Bill Mollison once called them invisible structures, things like legal aid, banking and credit, education, and so forth. So the Timbuktu Collective actually organizes programs and projects in each of these areas, and they function together as a whole. Some of their strategies, already alluded to in their mission or vision statement, are they want to focus on local self-governance so that it's not outside entities or big, large entities doing it. It's village-based. This is something different than having the kind of nuclear family or the single farmer residence-based organization. It's village-based, and that's very much in alignment with history in India. There's a big focus on producer-owned mutual aid business enterprises. So the actual economic activity should be owned and controlled by the people themselves. And mutual aid implies it should be for producing for their own needs. They mostly use cooperatives as the primary enterprise form to do that. There's a lot of emphasis on the use of model projects. Permaculture, I don't have to tell you the importance of model projects, going and seeing it with your own eyes, digging the shovel in the ground, doing the work is a hugely transformative educational mode. So they use that. And of course, their education also, as you'll see, isn't just model projects. They build this into the schools as well as the cultural activities that they do. So these are some of their strategies. Let's take a look at what they've accomplished. So this is the actual site of the original demonstration project. This was before. And then when they engaged in a lot of permacultural techniques, as well as some other practices, they were able to regenerate the forest landscape that had been denuded by goats and goat herding and so on. So they regenerated this landscape. There's even more up-to-date pictures and videos that show how lush it is, especially they get into the detail and you can see individual plants and so on. But this gives you a sense of the first step. Once they had that as a basis, they then moved into how do we educate others. So here they began reaching out to a diverse number of people, a lot of producers. How do we do this kind of work? How do we integrate these kind of techniques with forms of farming that may not be so sustainable? Similarly, they build it into the school, and I apologize, the images are a little grainy, but the actual school, beginning at very young ages, integrates how to do regenerative development as well as permacultural techniques and organic farming. In addition to that, it's really important that they do lots of people-to-people connection. So the building of enterprise and the building of land management and so on isn't just a book. It isn't a presentation. It's people talking about what they do to other people who share similar interests. Similarly, alternative banking and credit, people come together. This is all organized by the women, and I'll come back to this in a second to show you their model. You also have at the heart of their work, in addition to some of the permaculture and agroforestry, you have organic farming. This is how people are going to make a living. Productive agriculture to generate products to make a living. And in India, they use a lot of what's appropriate and traditional for their region. If you had images of this in around where I live, you probably wouldn't see someone walking behind cattle in their field, but in an event, the point being it's appropriate to the scale and the region. In addition to organic farming, they've recognized that we can't just produce stuff because then what happens to it? Well, we want to process and market it ourselves. So they built a processing facility. In that processing facility, they can take the grains they grow and the various seeds and here turn them into products like oils, packaged products that they can then sell. And of course, they're also producing for themselves to eat. And then they have to market this. They have a certified organic label and all of the different things that we see with some of the organics in our country. In addition to that, they have a lot of focus on culture and building in arts and crafts. This is one of the ways that they incorporate people with disabilities into the actual meaningful work and to make contributions to the life of the villages and to the region. So here is a model view of how they represent the banking, microlending co-op, and so on, the Women's Credit Co-op Federation. What I find striking about this is the cellular nature of it. You see those small cells, which are going to be individual families who are then clustered with other families who are then part of one of these 4 major projects. All of which function together with that center organizing. At each level, there's a different emphasis on the organization and who and the kind of focus it has, whether it's support and so forth. But what I notice about the organization is that it's very cellular-like, and it emphasizes that there are nested systems and larger levels of unity. A few outcomes I'll just note, and these numbers are actually need to be updated. These are just a few years old. I have not updated them recently, but this just gives you a sense of some of the things that they've accomplished over about 15 years. Now their project's more getting into a little bit longer, about 22 years, I believe now total. But it gives you a sense of some of the accomplishments and outcomes that they've had. All right, so what are some key lessons from this Timbuktu effort? They have a collective vision about what's possible. They use integrated farming operations. There's a key role for cooperative enterprises, very important. They use enterprise networks and clusters. So thinking about that cluster, the credit cooperative, for example, or the network that brings together different products into a central facility to help process it and value add it. They have a governance structure that emphasizes leadership by the people as opposed to experts from the outside. They use the actual people as experts. Educational centers are deeply important. So the very first before and after picture, that's what is meant by the academy. This is a place where experimental agriculture, permaculture, as well as all the different social and microcredit and so on can be experimented with and learned. And then, of course, they recognize the need to regenerate and sustain the resource base, fundamental to the operation. When I think about this, and I compare this with other places that I've studied, there are a few core factors that I think I want to give emphasis to that have emerged that show how larger scale local integrated development can happen successfully. I've mentioned the need of a strong vision. Without a vision, what is it that people are aiming for? This helps catalyze the potentials of the people. It inspires them to have a vision of what is possible. In addition to a vision, you have to have that base of the land, of the soil, of the waters. And so regenerative ecology becomes deeply important as a successful factor. There has to be a balanced mix of enterprise. So both cooperative as well as small scale enterprises. So by small scale, we mean some of the individual families have their own economic activity, even as they sometimes participate as part of cooperatives as well. So there's a diversification and a balance occurring. This helps lead to innovation. And it also means when something happens in one area, a blight, for instance, in another area, you have resilience. This is going to be, that's a familiar concept to permaculturalists. In addition, you have different sources of capital. So there's the credit co-op, there's micro loans, there's the use of the organic label and products sold on the regular market to generate income, and there's a variety of other ways. So having this diversified sources of capitalization is really important for the whole effort. You have an integration of production and distribution. So this helps promoting efficiency. So rather than each farmer having to bag their grain or press their seed oils, they have a centralized facility that can help integrate that, and that creates a distribution network for those products. And because it's organized as a co-op, they're all in control of the decision making and benefit from it. So this becomes an important piece, is that integration, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Engage learning. This is part and parcel of permaculture, of course, but it's part and parcel of this particular Timbuktu collective, as well as other regenerative development sites that I've studied. You have to educate people as part of new values, approaches, and techniques, as well as how those connect to more traditional or familiar values, approaches, and techniques. And the engaged learning part gives emphasis to the hands-on nature of the person-to-person relationship and the model projects and so on, as well as integrating it in with the children at school. Participatory governance and decision-making. So these things don't just happen on their own. People have to come together, plan, and make decisions. It's the only way to do it. The Timbuktu Collective is a particular model in this because they integrate both folks with disabilities who are traditionally left out of this process, and they have a whole program devoted to the Dalits, or the untouchable class, which is not typical in India, but they believe in true social equity and solidarity. And so that has to be reflected not in statements, but in the actual governance and decision-making process. Formal authority.
Oh, man.
This is an important piece that is sometimes forgot, is that to do these projects, who owns the land? What is its relationship to the government? How does it work with taxation? What about codes, statutes, land use, and so on? All of that has to be dealt with. And there has to be some way to protect the operation. So having some kind of legal establishment and standing becomes really important. And having clear boundaries and clear relationships becomes really important, so that we know, where does the buck stop, to use a kind of a trite phrase, but that formal authority is important. It's also important to have legal standing when larger powers or outside entities see these types of development efforts as a threat and come after them. If you have legal standing, it's really hard for them to undercut what's happening. Lastly, the celebration of culture and identity and belonging and these relationships is very, very deeply important to promote common cause, as well as unity and diversity. So these are some factors that I think the Timbuktu Collective exemplifies, and that I've seen, maybe not in their entirety, but at least pieces of them in other projects that I've looked at. So when I think about like a permaculture economy, these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about that we need to be focused on. Are these different factors, and how do we develop this and put them together? This leads to a few basic principles of what I want to call a decentralized system, or thinking about decentralization. I'm not going to go into a big critique of the capitalist system and so on. I want to focus on thinking about how do we enact at appropriate scale. And in our cases, we're thinking about those zones that we might call like the bioregion. So important principles would be that the resources of the bioregion should be controlled and utilized by local people. They shouldn't be owned and controlled by outside entities, nor should we be working them up and then exporting them out. So this is a key principle. Another principle is that the production, the things we're doing, the goods and services should be based mostly on consumer need, not on maximizing profits. This is not to say we shouldn't have profit. It's to say the goal is not to maximize profits or to have accumulation. The goal is to meet people's needs. Another core principle is to organize production and distribution primarily through cooperatives or some form of social solidarity enterprise, so that it's not left to individual proprietors to have to figure it out. By working together, there's greater efficiencies and economies of scale. Another principle is that local people should work in and control local economic enterprises. We shouldn't be reliant on outside forces or outside workers, nor should local people be having to migrate out to find meaningful, fulfilling work. We need to focus in on how do we create local enterprises that can engage local people first and foremost. And lastly, that the essential commodities of life, the things we most importantly need, food, shelter, materials, healthcare, education, you name it, as much as possible, we should produce this through local and regional enterprises, and not so that we're not dependent on outside forces. And of course, some regions are easier, it's easier to do this than others, but these are just principles, kind of guiding ideas around what we would call decentralization. These are quite different than our current dominant socioeconomic system. Lastly, I want to think about some questions. Any development program, I tend to ask myself these four things that flow from those principles I just highlighted. First of all, does this activity, does it meet everyone's essential needs for life in some way? And if it doesn't, then should it be the priority? Secondly, does it provide opportunities for meaningful work and increasing purchasing capacity? And that should say for the local people, but is this something that if someone engages in it, it's actually meaningful, they're contributing to the common good? Does it help them actually get purchase in life, whether that's through an appropriate income or it's through proper trade and barter to the goods they need? Third question, do local people control and manage this? And do they do so for their common welfare? I think that's an important piece. And then lastly, does this endeavor keep resources, productive capacity, and wealth working regionally for local development and regeneration rather than draining it out to serve outside interests? So these questions flowing from decentralization can sometimes be thought of also as maybe principles of a kind of economic democracy. If you want to truly democratize the economy, we want to work towards economic activity that helps us embody these principles that are embedded in these questions. So what does this mean in terms of design? Well, I think there's kind of, just as permaculture has its design principles, I think that what we might call perma-economy, there's actually a French thinker who has a book on this, although it's not translated into English, but perma-economy, like what does it actually mean to design at the bioregional level, let's say, when we're thinking about decentralized economics? Well, here's 5 principles I'll give you. First, account for cost of production. So we're all very aware that many of the goods and services we have do not represent their true costs. There's many externalities and the inputs and all the problems around, like the mining of minerals, or all the waste that occurs and then ends up being healthcare costs that people have to bear, right? But the cost of production should be accounted for in order to determine what's viable. And just as David Holmgren kind of has a little saying with his principles, I put one here, which is like, look, cost should not exceed market value or undermine ecological metabolism. In other words, you shouldn't do activity that doesn't yield a proper return, and because then it's a losing proposition. And secondly, if it undermines the environment, then you've undercut your longevity and you lead to all kinds of problems. So accounting for cost of production is crucial to economic development. Secondly, optimizing productivity. And so how do we do that? productivity is one of these words that people like to shy away from because they associate it somehow with the capitalist economy. But I would say the capitalist economy is very unproductive. It's not efficient. It wastes resources. It doesn't help people meet their needs and so on. What we mean by productivity is that production, economic activity, should be meeting collective needs, providing full employment as much as possible, using available resources, and utilizing our productive units fully. It makes no sense, for instance, to have a huge tractor if you're not using it properly. Like, why have it? So in other words, utilize things fully. This is very similar to the idea of like stacking of functions where you want to optimally get as much as you can out of a design thing. And the point here is that investments in economic activity should increase our collective wealth. A third design principle is to increase purchasing capacity. So people have to get along in life. So that means they need access to essential goods and services. We need to keep prices stable so they're not wildly fluctuating. People's income has to increase periodically, and there should be an increase in collective wealth over time. In other words, what some people call the standards of life, standards or quality of life, should include everyone and not just a few or not just some. So increasing purchasing capacity. And a way to think of this is not increasing people's consumption. Purchasing capacity is the capacity to gain purchase in life, to get one's needs met, is what we mean by purchasing capacity. Optimizing, I actually have optimizing productivity twice. That's a mistake. That yellow box on the right should say prioritize collective necessity, design error. I'll have to fix that. But what this means is we have to consider both our collective needs now as well as our future requirements. And in doing that, the focus should be ensuring everyone's basic needs. But we need to take into account some people have more needs than others. There's amenities in life that make it enjoyable. And some people engage in certain forms of work that are more meritorious. It might be more dangerous or risky, or it might involve a higher skill level. Who knows what it might involve? Should we account for that? We probably should. The point here is that we have to balance both current and future, the needs of current and future generations, as well as a variety of different needs. And again, I apologize for the typo. It should say prioritize collective necessity here, and I'll fix that. Adapt to changing circumstances. Of course, nothing is set in stone. Even these principles, our values, have to adapt to life. Different things happen, and being in tune with the evolution and fluctuation of nature and humanity is really important. In other words, any activity we do has to take into account the time, the place, and the people involved and adjust accordingly. So these are kind of design principles that we might think about when envisioning what a permaculture economy could look like. All right, so let's envision this. Let's give it a little bit of visualization. So I'm going to take this farm here, and let's imagine that this is a fully permacultured site. And that combine's just a relic now. So just, but the rest of it, let's imagine you got a farm, it's been permaculture designed, it's got agroforestry, regenerative development, you name it, and you have a site. The question is, how do we put that site into these other levels at the bioregional level? How do we create what Holmgren suggests is a kind of multinodal development? That's what I want to show as a way to envision how this could happen. Right now, that permaculture farm, for the most part in our current system, is utterly dependent on the global market context. The goods it produces, if they want to sell, it has to go to the market. So most farms get their inputs from the market, the global market, and then they send their products off. And then you have this whole chain of middle people. And those are the people that skim all the value out of those so-called raw materials before it finally ends up back to the consumer in the local market. That's very typical. Most farmers I know are stuck in this particular position. So an alternative to this is that maybe our permaculture farm can cut out some of that global market context and work directly with consumers. And this has in fact been a strategy that we're all familiar with. So farmers markets, community supported agriculture, and a variety of creative other ways that are similar to those are ways in which farmers are producing things and getting them directly to consumers without all the middle people there. That's been one strategy. Another strategy that we're beginning to see is that farmers recognize and producers recognize, and not just them, but others in the local context recognize that it isn't just getting like vegetables to people, but other forms of products where we need to value add. So building a local and regional processing, for example, becomes a key strategy. And I'll give an example of that from my own region in a second. Or having local retail sites as well. This starts to begin to value add and create other forms of employment, utilizing local goods for local needs. Again, the farm might still be putting things into the global market, and the global market context is still largely a force. Remember those arrows that Holmgren gave us? It's one of those forces that cuts back into the local, but we're beginning to see more potentiality here for local development in this particular thing. And that's because we're adding value-added enterprises to work up what that permaculture farm is producing. The example I want to give is I'll give Sweet Creek jams. This is produced right here in the Willamette Valley. And so they source not always local fruit because not all the local, they can't always get what they need. But ideally, they could source all the different fruits they have. Apples, raspberries, mulberries, blueberries, strawberries. These are things permaculturalists put in their yards. I have almost all those in my yard. In fact, I do have all those in my yard. And honey, and maybe beet sugar, potentially, that's grown here in the Willamette Valley. All that can be grown locally. It can be processed by Sweet Creek. They can can it and jar it, and they can send it off to Red Barn Natural Grocery Store here in Eugene or any of the other local grocery stores where I can go buy it. Sweet Creek also sends it off to chain retail stores as well as larger distribution hubs. And of course, as climate change progresses, those lemons, well, we can actually grow the lemons here in I mean, Jan Spencer's here at this particular meeting. He grows lemons, and I have some of his lemons in my fridge. Point being, this is an example of how we can value add. So you see these different permaculture farms can be producing, and then we can value add it as part of an economy. Now, let's put this into an even more complex economic ecosystem. This is an example of what might be possible. This does not exist, but as an example of what could be possible. And I'm thinking about Holmgren's multinodal development here. I'm thinking about the idea of having cellular development at each of these productive agricultural sites. And then you create the tissue where you put them together into clusters. So they might produce a whole variety of products, but they might specialize in certain products. The reason being their soils are more suited for those products than other things. So rather than try to grow everything on the farm, they grow what's most ideally suited for that landscape, knowing that they're going to be part of a cluster with other farms and other production units that can then send that to local and regional processing facilities and local distribution hubs that can then get it to local retail. All of that can generate economic activity, including capital that can be reinvested back into this system. Not only that, but some of these products can be worked up and then marketed to the global market. So there's no reason why the Willamette Valley can only produce this for itself. Once we meet our needs and we have abundance, what are we supposed to do with that in permaculture? You're supposed to share abundance. Well, how can we do that in our current world? Well, we can send it out as a product. The point being is that this is an example of how site-specific permaculture development could be harnessed as part of a larger bioregional economic formation. And of course, that requires planning. And that requires some kind of way to organize this. And so there's this local development board, maybe we could call it that provides essential services for farms. It helps coordinate, it provides business support. Rather than have each farm figure it out, there are people that can help them share. Rather than have each co-op reinvent the wheel, there can be incubators that help co-ops get started. Point being, this model tries to take local value and wealth that's produced at different sites and circulates that locally to meet local needs and generate wealth in the local community. This is a very different situation than what we're currently living, but it's a potentiality. I could rattle off statistics like the fact that here in Eugene, Oregon, even though we could grow 100% of our vegetables and fruits, we grow something like 4% of them locally consumed. The potentiality is vast. So once again, I'm going to end and then take questions and discussion. I think that if we think about multinodal development at the level of the region, and we integrate permaculture's classical site design concepts at that larger landscape scale that David Holmgren's talking about, but then we build these other institutions in these particular areas you see on your screen, we can create, you know, this cute term, a perma economy or an integrated permaculture economy. So that's the potentiality. These are some of the principles and some of the ideas that I wanted to share to stimulate a vision of what might be possible to do just that, building an integrated permaculture economy. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and take some questions if folks have questions about the ideas or the presentation.
There's a question posed by Avin. Does Toby Hemingway talk about this stuff in his book, Permaculture City?
Let me put that question out. How many of you have read Permaculture City? I see a few hands. Does Toby Hemingway talk about that? Heather, I see your hand. I don't have Permaculture City on my shelf here.
Sorry, I don't remember, but I have it on my shelf. I could look at the contents. I don't remember.
I guess. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Evan.
I was just going to say, I asked that question partly to, just know if it was in the book, but also just, I really like your idea of creating the different new systems. So my thinking is originally, going like, how can we create those positions? How can we create that, education, those, almost like a trade, where people could, have that as like an option to have a career path or an integrated society. Excellent. With those types of things. How could that kind of be maybe the next step?
Excellent question. So I'm going to, I just put a link in the chat for those of you who have access to the chat, to a paper that was written by Charles Paprocki and Wayne Wiseman back in 2015. And it's the first articulation of the idea of a kind of permaculture economy of which I'm aware. And most of the paper is a discussion of the progressive utilization theory, which is I'm here representing the Proud Institute, but many of the principles and things that I highlighted are in that paper. And what I want to draw your attention to is precisely your point, Avin, is towards the end of the paper, they start asking the question, well, how do we do this? How do we get started, right? And so what they propose is a number of things. So one is they propose the idea of a permacore, but how do we create a network of permaculture experts and advanced students whose mission is to increase expertise in planning, design, and implementation of socioeconomic units of this larger system, right? Not unlike what permaculture's tried to do. We try to educate people about site design. Well, we need some kind of core of people that can do that work. And then they propose some different courses for that. So there would be like a permaculture design course, a team leader course, a community leader course, and so on. And some of those are things that are actually offered out there as part of what we call social permaculture. And then they talk about different ways in which to do like membership and dues and how to generate resources to fund it, and so forth. And then they, so that's one way they think about it, is how do we organize a kind of educational team of people who do that work?
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I could say more, but I don't want to take up time if other people have questions.
So there's a good question in the chat about finding financial and legal resources to enable co-op ownership of land and homes in Washington. And I don't have a direct answer for that question other than I'll say two things. One would be to think about finding existing cooperative housing and asking them how they did that. And then also thinking about some of these alternative forms of land ownership that take it out of the hands of individuals and put it in the hands of entities. And so there's some work done on that. But I don't know if anyone has actual resources on that. And then I see Brad, your hand, and I was going to actually see there's I know there's a particular group that does cooperative legal work, and maybe you're going to suggest that, but I don't want to steal any question you have.
No, mine was just getting in the stack. I actually
Sure.
would suggest, although wouldn't necessarily be oriented toward Washington, but Jason stimulated my thinking on that. Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland is, and that's probably what Jason was thinking of, is as far as I know, the go-to place on the West Coast. So that would be a place to start looking for. At least they might know who would know those things, Mike, in Washington, if they're not familiar with Washington State. But yeah, my hand was up just to get in the stack for comment, kind of thing. So, but I don't need to go right now if there's other people that have things.
You had your hand raised for a question.
Okay.
And I put another thing in your mouth. So
knowing me, it's less question and more comment to stimulate conversation. I have two thoughts. One is a slight critique on the increasing purchasing capacity. For a lot of people, we need to do that. People that don't have enough, especially around the world and here. However, my study of the energy equation and that the reason we have so much for so many people, despite the inequality of it all, the maldistribution, is because of cheap energy, which we don't have, we're not going to have. So I would be personally more focused on just meeting everybody's material needs, and then beyond that, the cultural and Maslow's hierarchy kind of stuff. But so I'm just throwing that out as a minor critique of that one phrase. The main thing I wanted to say is that to build something like that, and I'm sure some people here, and I'm sure Jason is familiar with the Emilia Romagna cooperative networks in Italy and other ones, but they're of course Mondragon in Spain, and but Mondragon is a little bit more centrally organized, and as I understand it, and the Emilia Romagna are more decentralized. And the key function, besides that they got laws passed, in Italy to support their multi-stakeholder cooperatives, are what are called consortia, plural of consortium. And so they're networked into these, and they all support them and get benefits from them. And it's a chicken and egg thing. You need kind of resources to get those going. You need organizations, people to be members of them. So it's, how do you get that thing going is a big question. I think there was a certain necessity historically that led to people stepping into great needs, which things like homelessness and affordable housing might be an area that's not being met, and that might be an area for that I'm thinking. So I'm just throwing that out there. Any further thoughts on those kind of ideas from Jason or anybody else? But the idea of a decentralized network of consortia that provide both the political representation and advocacy, as well as services and coordination and education and things like that.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. So I actually put a link. I've done it's kind of a voiceover. In fact, the slides I did on Timbuktu are in that video, but the first half of it's on Emilia-Romagna, and it kind of outlines their system. And what Brad's speaking to is what, at least in the literature that I'm most familiar with, we call a cooperative association. So these consortia, they provide very invaluable support to the actual production co-ops. So things like legal aid, education, you know, the kind of thing that like the sustainability, the other link that I put in, the Law Center provides, that's deeply important. They also help make strategic decisions about how to invest surplus and where to invest that, based on that prioritization of collective necessity in the here as well as in the future. So making key strategic decisions that the rank and file in the co-op, you know, they're thinking about the work they're doing. They're not thinking about kind of the bigger picture. And the consortia who are comprised of representatives from the co-ops themselves, right? So they're thinking at that kind of level, and that's an essential piece. And so in the slide I presented, the local development board would kind of serve that function of the consortia to some extent. And then the last thing that I'll say on, you mentioned about purchasing capacity. Not everyone likes that term, but another way to think of that is that, you know, I wholly agree with you about meeting people's basic essential needs. But the idea behind purchasing capacity is so that we actually empower people to be engaged in productive activity that not only generates the goods and services as they need to meet their needs, but also provides them with whether it's income or the production of something they can trade in order to meet those needs. So it's not only it's kind of like not just providing the fish, but also teaching people how to fish, and ensuring they have access to the conditions like clean water and so on to do the work. And so I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. But I really appreciate your comments so much, Brad. A lot. Let me just take a quick peek in the chat, and then I see Jan's hand as well. Quick, are you a teacher at U of O? I work at the University of Oregon. I have taught environmental studies courses as well as environmental ethics courses in the past, and that includes having students read and learn about permaculture in those courses, as well as integrated local development in those courses. I no longer teach those courses because I'm too busy teaching professors how to teach, which is my primary professional occupation in any event. But yes, and then the other thing in the chat was global climate crisis. How can we find a way to integrate these principles with the next generation? Let me think about that one for a second. And that gets into an educational question again. And then I want to take Jan's question.
Yeah. Oh, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Huh. I sound odd myself. I sound okay?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You sound just like you normally do, Jan.
okay. Well, I'm not sounding that way to myself, but anyway, okay. Thanks, Jason, very much. Of course, I'm sure that a number of us are doing some of these kinds of at base level of permaculture, more local self-economy at the ground level. I'd like to point out that some of these items that you've been talking about, Jason, how do we go from a very cool permaculture property, which I'm acquainted with a good number of those here in River Road. I'd like to point out there's a person here, Maitre Erson, who is involved with Kailash Eco Village in Portland. That is a substantial increase in scale that puts a lot of these ideas that you brought up, Jason, more within reach because it's something like 50 people living in the same place. That's a place that was a rundown apartment complex that people don't know, that's been turned into like a miraculous eco village in Portland and Maitri is here. If it fits in, I'd love to have her reflect on what you've said, Jason, and how that might apply or what that makes her think of there at Maitri Eco Village. It's one of my favorite places. It's good.
I welcome that contribution. If you so want to share.
Boy, what is the deal?
Hi, good evening to all. So I live in Kailash Eco Village here in Portland, and what we're doing is engaging everyone that lives in the eco village to be productive in many ways. And so there's a big effort in producing at least 50% of our food consumption, and a big effort to close the loop in a sense that we keep our human excreta on site. Any raindrop that falls from the sky is usually distributed or kept here on site as well. Kailash is really when Ole and I founded this, my own personal intake in this is that part of the basic needs of human life to be sustained is a good dwelling, good housing, opportunity that opens up to everyone who can basically sign a legal contract, in other words. So I'm focused on providing that kind of housing, and just because the 5 essential basic necessity, essentially necessity for supporting life is housing, to have so that's basically Kailash, and I would like to invite everyone when they come out to Portland to contact us and just see what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if you all have a website or something like that, it looks like I heard, there it is. Thank you. I was going to say, someone please put that in the chat. And of course, websites only tell us so much, right? But I really appreciate you sharing that. And to Jan's point about, I mean, this raises an important question. So much of permaculture is focused on as Holmgren talks about, and as I mentioned, a kind of nuclear family or single kind of residence as opposed to social housing. And I use the term social housing intentionally because I don't want us to restrict our thinking to cooperative housing or eco villages, because those sometimes to be can tend to be very affluent in terms of who has access to them. And so I just want to put out as a question, like to broaden our thinking about what we mean by social housing in terms of the unit at the level of the community. But I think a huge challenge is, how do we build community in our current configuration? And that's a huge challenge. Are there other questions? Or I gave a bit of a quick 1-sentence response about steady state economics, and I'm afraid to answer that question properly would take me a bit of time. And so I want to see if there's other questions. Am I teaching other classes? I do occasionally teach some things on Zoom, But after tonight, I'm on a bit of a hiatus because I have some very much needed writing projects that need done. I'm neglecting my writing duties. Thank you, Jan, for noting that. Galen.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. This has been a really wonderful, thought-provoking. My question is, and I'm sure this is a simple answer, what do you see as the essential things to get started in building something like this?
That's actually not such a simple answer, but one thought I have is, noting the different factors that I presented. One of them is something that I think many of us are already doing, which is engaged learning. So learning, getting out, seeing ideas, Jan talks about that a lot. And certainly, I mean, the place where I live, literally I visited on one of his site tours, several years before I happened to now be the steward of the place. Kind of crazy, but, so I think engaged learning, and then thinking about how to build coalitions with others who are engaged in some of this important work, but under very different names and banners. And so how do we build those relationships and learn from each other and not fall prey to the idea that we have the answer, but rather recognize that we have piece or pieces of an answer. So how can we build coalitions with others? I think that is important. And then, I mean, those are probably the two that I'm going to give stress to that I think are within viable. And I'm thinking about at a region, a larger level. So, I could give a glib answer and say, plant some plants in your yard, and, we can do those things, but I'm taking your question, Galen, as asking about how do we do this at scale or begin to do it at scale. And so those are two places I think about. And then the third one I'm going to throw out is to envision some kind of a practical project, probably involving a cooperative and probably involving some kind of either production or meeting of a key essential need. So Brad mentioned housing, I think would be a big one. And we all see implications of that. In Eugene, we have the largest per capita unhomed rate in the country. I'm sure I know in the Pacific Northwest, that's true in other places. It's pretty high. Food's fairly established. However, the issue around food is that how could you think about creating a cooperative that helps provide access for people who otherwise can't afford some of the good quality local foods, and thinking about that carefully, and organizing something around that. And then that's going to get you into questions about capitalization and legal standing and so forth. But some kind of a cooperative project organized around an essential need. And I would argue that I've given the steps almost: educate ourselves about what's there, form coalitions with people, and in the forming of those, do a project together. So something like that.
If I could just add something that I think you spoke on earlier that kind of speaks to this is, I've noticed a lot of missing links in the bigger picture. We might have mapping things out, having a cooperative vision can allow us to find out what's missing. I've seen that in food systems. I've seen that in housing systems where there's something missing, and it might be a legal thing that's missing. But like charting those things out, I think is really neat. And also creating intentions as a community of where we want to go. And not just like an intentional community, but as a, let's say, Pacific Northwest, a regional community, like where do we want to go? And I think speaking that to the younger generation and allowing them to have our dreams can really help us to move forward and do like things beyond our imagination.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, David. I threw in the chat like asset mapping, beginning to really map what's out there and filling in some of those links, but also you were speaking there to the question of vision. And that's the first thing I emphasized on what I've learned from projects is they have a strong vision that really inspires people. And so so as we're building coalitions and educating ourselves, be thinking like, okay, what's the vision that we're crafting here? And how can I take the different pieces of there's many great visions out there. How do we begin to integrate some of their key pieces? So I really appreciate what you're saying a lot. I see Jack's hand and I want to move to that.
Okay, I always wonder about the idea of food. Like we can only grow so much of our food, or we need to bring in food. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that it seems to me that food is one of the easiest things that we could deal with. I mean, we can grow in our front yard, we can go in our backyard, we can do vertical gardens, we can go inside and outside. I mean, there are so many different ways that we can be food sufficient that I guess I don't understand why that is so often brought up as a difficult need. I mean, is that making sense, or do you understand at least where I'm getting at? Because there's a movie called Need to Grow. And if you haven't seen it, and if you're into kind of growing food and energy, actually, I would suggest it, because in that there's a person who does this vertical gardening, and I don't have all the stats, but a very, very small square footage of area, he grows a lot of food. So the ability and the knowledge to do this is out there, and I'm kind of curious as to why we aren't more aware of that and why we're still having a hard time with food.
Thanks, Jack. I appreciate that. I use food in the example, the imaginative exercise of an integrated local economy, precisely because many of the elements I was discussing you can find, I mean, and out there, and it's a matter of putting them together. And certainly some of the work that the Proud Institute, the organization that I'm affiliated with, has done includes ideas such as helping provide ideas, concepts, and resource support for farmers who want to convert, say, growing grass seed into growing beans and grains in the Willamette Valley, as an example. Repurposing the county fairgrounds to becoming a food hub. That can be not just a farmer's market, but a place where people can value add and have a commercial kitchen, as well as having the opportunity to create products that are affordable for people who can't afford them. In our neighborhood, I know Jan's could speak to this as well, but it's like taking some of the abundance that different individual yards and places have and bringing them together as part of like festivals or events, and sharing them, inviting others to that. But this starts getting, the reason why it becomes complex, Jack and others, is that one reason we don't do some of that now is because people call the authorities and like, did you produce that in a commercial kitchen? Do you have a food handler's license? Do you have a temporary restaurant license? Like, these issues begin to come up, and it's why getting into some of the legalities of it becomes really important. As an example, we successfully fought someone who said you can't sell your produce from your garden out of the front yard, and we fought that because actually the land was zoned county, and the zoning regulations here in Eugene allow county land to have a farmer's stand, to have a little stall, so you can sell it out of your front yard, or give it away if you want. So, but we had to research that and go and meet the city official and write up the letter. Like, that's where it begins to get a little complicated, is how we organize it. So I think you're right. The potentiality is vast, and there's some wonderful approaches and ideas. And I think it's a matter of, this is why I give emphasis to how do we do it at scale and begin to organize it in a more formal way, so that we can ensure that we don't run into these obstacles, and we can help ensure that the people who most need it can get access to it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Brad, you have your hand.
Yeah, this one is just, I want to point people to, I'm actually preparing to work on this housing, kind of what I'm calling resilient communities, concept. So I put a thing in the post, in the chat. I got my email in there. Anybody who would like to support or be involved in that sort of thing. I mean, obviously, my tree is already doing it, and other people, but we've got a property here we've looked at in the area in Eugene, but I'm not thinking of just that property. So I'm just putting it out that, look at you, feel free to get in touch with me if you're interested, and even just talking about that sort of thing. That's all.
Can I speak to one thing that David mentioned, if I may? And I also want to recognize folks' time, as well as my own, and my children who are probably wanting to see their dad. But it's one thing that I've encountered, working at a university. Each fall I work with 18, 19-year-olds coming in they're just starting out at the university, and we get into questions about the future, and when I pose the question, most of them view it very bleakly. There's a sense of realism about the sheer scale of problems that we face, and I think that that realism is important and actually healthy to understand. We can't sugarcoat what we're facing, but what I find is that they don't have a kind of sense of hope or possibility beyond just carving out the most secure position they can, even if ethically they know, well, we need a new system, but I don't know how to do that, so I'm going to carve out what I can. And unfortunately, most of the positions now are becoming more and more precarious and not very stable. And young people are aware of this. So a lot of my work is around educating them about historical process and the ways in which people in the most destitute of conditions have persevered, the strategies they've adopted, the ways in which they've taken up their conditions and developed potential and identified potentialities and developed them in just unimaginable ways, and some of the things that this happen, and that helps students begin to see possibility. And the other aspect to it is the one that I really wrestle with a lot, is how do we create more than just like hope and possibility, but actual working conditions and possibilities where young people, when they graduate, or and I'm not talking about people that are always going to university. I'm talking about anyone that, when they want to plug in, can have meaningful work opportunities that contribute towards their community and to the things they truly value. How do we create those kinds of work possibilities and positions? So to go back to something David was saying, and to connect it with what I was suggesting in response to Galen, is that these projects, if we want to think about is how do we build positions in them for younger people that are bringing energy and are bringing certain important values, but otherwise aren't finding ways to live those. So how can we help them live them? And that's going to have to be positions that are provide living wages and treat them fairly. We can't just exploit young people's labor, because they want to learn the skill, they're willing to work hard. I love that. But, they got to make a living too. And so how do we, so this is part of the idea behind purchasing capacity is how do we create purchase in life? And how can we create positions that are viable for younger people? So I guess I want to, the wrench I'm throwing in here is thinking about projects in a way that is creating the new world of work that younger people really want to embody in their lives, but are desperately unable to find through the conventional means. So I wanted to add that. I think I being the teacher, Zoom doesn't tell me 1, 2, 3 on these 3 hands who was one, but I think Maitri, and did I pronounce that correctly? Please correct me if I have it wrong. I think you were first.
And I think you're right.
I think it was Jan.
Why
Oh,
don't you go, Maitri? You're unmuted.
Okay. I just want to add to that, Jason, to what you said, because when Oli and I started Kailash Eco Village, the one thing that we both realized is he and I need to have a lot of inspiration in our hearts, because the daunting task of a big vision and mission requires really a big fire in your heart. Working with people is the most challenging part of creating this project. Really, it is. And so oftentimes you feel just targeted for no reason. But if you got that fire in your heart, you cannot wait for the sun to come out so that you could be out there and be working. So when you take on a project, look inside yourself and see what it is that inspires you to move on, because Kailash has been 15 years and we're still having a lot of challenges. And it's easy, but you gotta find fun in doing something like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Well spoken. Maybe Jan?
Sure. I just want to mention I know of an organization in Syracuse, New York, with the name the Onondaga Earth Corps. And I've talked with some of the kids who actually have had their lives affected. I'm not going to try to explain, but it's giving particularly disadvantaged young people, because Syracuse is in the Rust Belt, and the opportunity to gain civic education. How can they help the community? It's tree planting, it's water quality. I'll put a message into the chat, and if anybody wants to look into that, I don't have their website, but you could find it very easily. But it's an excellent example of young people. Every city, town should have a youth corps like what exists there in Syracuse. That's good.
Thank you, Jan. Jack?
yeah. And another thing I I guess I'm putting this out there to give people something to think about, because I think a lot of us realize what we're kind of up against and what's going on the planet. I'm not going to go name all the things that are going on, but a lot of it is because there's an elite small handful of people who pretty much control what's happening on the planet. And they're very well organized and of course have the resources. And I guess what I'm getting at is that there are a lot of us out there, millions in fact, who want to create and want to live in a world that works for all. And I realize, like what the way a person just got through saying about the difficulty of working, people working together and working with each other. But I would like people to start thinking about, there are so many of us, and if we all got focused and organized, we could do an amazing amount of stuff and actually have some potential to change what's going on. But I don't really see that happening on the scale that needs to happen to make that happen. And I'm just kind of wondering, why are millions of us out there who want something different? Why are we not more focused on coming together and organizing and collaborating with each other to create that alternative world, and having to really realize that we really don't have a choice? We either got to do that, or we're going to probably have some very big problems in the coming times. And I guess that's what I'm saying, but I just want people to start thinking that we need to really get people who think like us a lot better organized, coordinated, cooperative, and collaborative. Okay.
That I could go on for a long time in response to that, but a number of us attempted to begin a process of that by organizing and hosting a new era convergence this past summer. And a key goal of that was how do we begin to coordinate amongst different efforts, and how do we begin to mobilize more people around a shared common vision. And that included some thinking about how to overcome certain barriers, whether real or perceived, and so on and so forth. But it was an attempt to bring the very issue that you're noting, Jack, to greater focus, and that's an ongoing process. So that process continues to churn interesting ideas, such as providing an asset map of a variety of organizations who are doing different forms of work, such as organizing a project to bring communities together around scenario planning. So like, well, what happens if what if in 2 years the capitalist market really collapses in a way that not just takes what people are already feeling the pain of, but really puts it in a severe form. What are we doing now to prepare for that? And other types of scenarios. I'm just throwing one out, right? It's also generated, how do we establish networks of communication among different groups, and begin to learn from each other precisely so that we can organize and mobilize. And then I would also offer up that there's a variety of ways in which people are actually organizing and mobilizing themselves right now at this time. And a key focus on that is thinking about, well, what are some of the shared interests that people have beyond just the abstract, we want to survive or get past, some big calamity, but like, what are the actual material interests that people have, as well as some of their social interests, even spiritual interests, but what binds people. And so one example that I'm seeing is a lot of organizing around issues of labor. So young people are on fire right now organizing union work across different workplaces like coffee, Starbucks, Pete's Coffee. Organizing's happening. The largest labor organizing uprising in world history has occurred in India just in the last couple of years. In fact, the two largest were both in India right before COVID and then during COVID. We're talking hundreds of millions of people rising up for better working conditions. That's unprecedented. I mean, just absolutely unprecedented if we really think about it. And so that's happening. That's out there. So the point is that the energy and the need are palpable, and the beginnings of expression of that are taking place. How to organize that in a way that really coordinates it, that's a big conundrum, and a lot of people are asking that question. But to be asking the question because we recognize what's happening and the potentiality, like that's a huge first step, and we've taken that step. So now it's getting into some of the, there's a need to identify shared values and so on, but it's also like, what are some strategies that we can take? But it's a big question. I don't have an answer other than to say, keep posing the question and keep seeking answers through dialogue and engagement with others as much as possible, and through, these projects that are going to provide palpable, tangible, demonstrable opportunities for people to learn.
And just very briefly, you mentioned it as a conundrum, and well, I mean, if you look at what's going on, I guess it is, but I have a hard time understanding why. Why can't intelligent people just realize that we gotta get over that and around that and work together in a way that makes it happen? And I don't want to repeat myself anymore,
Sure.
but
The mind,
I couldn't help but say that.
The mind is a very complex thing. There are many, many deep-seated assumptions and habits and so forth that have to be shed. And I'll just keep it at that. Y'all, it's 8:34. It's been an hour and a half. I've
Thank you. It's been awesome.
I've
Really.
really,
Thank you, Jay.
yeah,
Appreciate
thank you.
it.
I've deeply appreciated the opportunity to engage with you all, and I sincerely hope that this was a little bit of a tidbit or teaser of substance to provoke that my provocation that I came with is effective to the extent that you're thinking. And I got that from the questions and from the comments. So I look forward to future discussion and conversations. And David, maybe I need to turn it back to you to wrap it up.
Thank you so much,
so much.
Jason. Appreciate you. And his information is on our website, northwestpermaculture.org. And we appreciate all of our speakers that have been a part of the speaker series. And if you want to sign up for our newsletter, just go to northwestpermaculture.org and sign up there. And there's a lot of events happening, including our permaculture convergence this past fall. And there's a bunch of other events leading up to that coming up. So we are happy you've been here, and thank you. This should be put online in the next day. So look for that link on our website. So thank you all.
And thank you
so much, Jason. It was beautiful.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, David, everybody. Next time.
Yeah, well done.